All right. We are live. Let's get this party started. Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm. I'll be your host, and today I'm joined with my good friend Doug Hegerin. Hey, Doug.
Hey Kirk, good to see you again on Friday. Another Friday and another day of preparing for a weekend that most of you can relate to, of finishing up the day and running to something else for the kids. It's it's always something going on. We're going another scout camping trip this weekend, so we're heading out tonight for 2 days for the last outdoor one. See where I live, yeah, it gets a little nippy. So the last outdoor one for the season, and then we'll move to some more indoor camping, except for there's a winter camp out, I believe, in December or January, where they actually have to dig their own Quincy, which is basically a snow fort that they have to dig out and sleep under. And if they're successful, it's extremely cozy, I hear, and almost too warm. And if they're not successful, well, you know what? You're waiting for them to dig out a hole or a pit, and you're sleeping on top of it in the frigid weather. So, yeah, welcome to camping in the elements. So.
Yeah, well, I hope they don't freeze to death, Doug. I'm not that extreme. I was just about to say, you were talking about your normal weekend of doing stuff with the kids, and I was like, I'm from Massachusetts. We take it to the extreme. This weekend, I'm flying down to Nashville with my son to go play in a hockey tournament for the long weekend. So I'm leaving actually in about 2 hours. So that'll be fun. The only downside is we actually went there last year, and I'm not really excited to go there again. Like, Nashville's nice, but I don't need to do it twice. It's good. It's good the first time. Like,
I'm gonna make a plug. I mean, I don't know how you are in terms of like quality, food, but I'll tell you, Nashville, in my opinion, at least from what I've been able to try, it is probably, and I've heard the same thing about Charleston, although I haven't had the pleasure to go there. Of the cities that are around this country that don't get Michelin stars for their restaurants, Nashville would be one I'd put on the list that's ready and primed. I mean, there's some amazing food there. I mean, get away from Broadway. I think it's Broadway where all the stuff. I mean, whether or not you've got the energy for the nightlife, it is what it is. I mean, that's where bachelorettes like to go hang out, and they like to march goalposts down after beating Alabama. Tide got rolled over last weekend for anybody that's into sports. But yeah, there's a lot to do in amazing places in Nashville outside that. Recommend one for anybody going there that doesn't mind splurging a little bit. It's called the Catbird Seat. I hesitate to tell people because it's hard enough to get a seat there, but it's an incubator for the next upcoming chefs, and it's arguably the best meal I've ever had. So
nice. Well, with all my food issues, Doug, I can't enjoy nights out like I used to. Used to go out all the time. I'm a bit of a foodie, but I just can't eat.
That's right. That's right. Your diet's pretty limited. I remember that.
It is, but I'm healthy, so I'm not complaining. But I do miss the good old days when I can eat anything and not worry about repercussions. And now, as I'm getting up there in age, I'm not celebrating the way I used to. So,
well, remember this, Kirk. If you want to be healthy, all you have to do is cut out everything fun in life. That's
true.
The key. That's the answer.
Yeah. I'm gonna die at an old age, not having had any fun. Fortunately, I had plenty when I was younger, so I'm not fiending for it. But it is what it is. Anyway, well, we're gonna dive right in. So we got a lot to talk about. So I've had this piece that I've talked about over time, and I've actually got two pieces I want to share. One I'm going to do this week because it pairs with everything else we're going to talk about, and that piece is inflation. I know a bunch of you have gotten some hate mail because I talked about the new paradigm, and I haven't talked about it because it hasn't paired with all the stuff we're sharing. But I ideally want to do that next week. But this week I'm going to talk about inflation. And here's what I want to share. Most people don't understand inflation. Now, here's kind of a primer about inflation. Now, don't turn off your radios, your phones when you hear me talk about inflation. It's the most boring topic ever. Years ago, I used to do some deep research on inflation. I did this thing called the Inflation Monitor. I did it once a month, sent it out to people on my email list, and crickets. No one cared. No one read it. I mean, it was the most aggregated place of inflation I could find. No one else was doing anything like it. Now, some people are doing other things like Trueflation came out with a good metric. So there's things out there that they're actually pretty interesting now, but back then there really wasn't much. Anyway, so I learned a lot during that period because I was pulling information from anywhere. Amazon had some good numbers that they subsequently hid, and they're no longer public. State Street had some good numbers, and they subsequently hid and no longer publish. There were a lot of places that used to they published it initially, and then I think what happened is somebody quote unquote bought them out. Basically, what happened is someone else bought the information. So I think what happened with State Street is they were publishing it, and then someone else bought the data stream, or they owned it, so then no one else could see it. And it was just kind of like, well, that's garbage. Like, it was great information, and now I don't even know if you can buy it. I think it was probably just basically owned. Somebody bought the licensing rights to it. But you found some really great data there that you no longer see out there. And so over time, what I've noticed is basically the government's CPI. So the government publishes the Consumer Price Index, and that is considered the quote unquote gold standard of inflation metrics published by the government. That's what the Social Security and any sort of COLA is usually linked to, is the CPI. So everything that is inflation adjusted is related to the CPI. Now you can imagine that there are probably some really good reasons to manipulate the CPI lower if a lot of the government inflation metrics are tied to the CPI. If the inflation's 10% and the government says it's 2%, and so that means they only have to raise Social Security payments by 2%, I wonder if there's any sort of bias in the numbers. Let me think about that. Hold on a second. I've got an answer for you. All right, I'm going to put on my tinfoil.
I'm blinding a little bit here. I've got the glasses on. These are transitions, but I'm starting to have trouble seeing with all that shine off your head.
Yeah, I got my tinfoil hat back on, Doug, because it's important to talk about this. So my point isn't whether it is or isn't manipulated. I would argue it is, but some people might say it's not. I don't really care because I don't trust it. All I know is there's a heavy bias for the government not to have it be high. Now, if you look at Shadow Stats, Williams published this website called Shadow Stats, and he has actually looked at the CPI from decade. So basically what's happened is they've adjusted the CPI calculations over time, which I could argue is the right thing to do because over time, our economy changes. Technology wasn't a big part of our economy. Now it is. So our economy's changed over time. And so I could argue, okay, there's a reason and a rationalization for changing it. I'm not sure whether it's right or wrong, and I'm not going to sit here and say it is or isn't. I'm just saying that I could understand the argument that there's a reason to change it. However, if you look at the older metrics, and using his site, and I'm going to crib his site, but if you look at the old metrics, you know, the 1990 metrics, as of right now, the CPI should be somewhere around 8%. According to the new metrics, it's somewhere around 4%. So who knows what's correct and what's not correct, right? Because someone's running the numbers and you just have to buy it. But everything's pegged to it. So you don't have a choice of believing it or not. It is a number that you just have to accept that's it to be 2%. Negative, because negative is a real problem for them. But they certainly don't want it to be high because all of a sudden, now that's their. It just has to do with their incentive, right? Now, you say, well, why 2%? Great question. No one has any idea. They literally pulled 2% out of thin air and said, we think that inflation should be around 2%. Now, they might have a reason, but they've never shared it. No one I know has any idea why it's 2%, but that's their target. They've just picked that as a target. Now, I think it's a bogus number. And here's why I think that. Because if you look at history, if you go back, quite some time, what you'll notice is that if you go back, a few decades, having it be 2% is not normal. If you look at the 80s, the 70s, and 80s, it was in the double digits. if you look at pretty much the 90s, it certainly wasn't 2. If you look at the last 15 years, yeah, it was 2%, 3%. It was in that range. But that doesn't mean that's normal. It just means that is the recent history of what we've seen it to be. And that is pegging our recency bias that somehow that's the correct number. It doesn't mean it is. I don't know what the right number is. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that they have not given a reasonable reason as to why 2% is a good number. I don't think it's a good number. Maybe it is in this environment. Maybe it's not. But the point is, just understand that is the bias that's coming from the government on the CPI. So rightly or wrongly, it is what it is. Now, the fact that it's incorrect, like probably almost any other government statistic is incorrect, the fact that it's incorrect is, you may say, well, I object to that. Okay, but there is a trend. So even though the number may be inaccurate, you can look at the trend. Is the trend going up or is it going down? Even, if you look at the ShadowStats website, it's just shadowstats.com. If you go there, what you'll notice is that, it in 2022, I think it hit 8.5%, 9% in the new numbers, and the old numbers hit somewhere like 14%. But the trend was higher. You could say, well, there's a big difference. Yeah, there's a big difference, but it doesn't matter. It was really high. And so what we needed to know was inflation was really high. And now it's declining. You might say, well, it's incorrect. You could be correct, but it's still declining. That's what we need to know. Where is inflation going? Is it going up or is it going down? That's a really important metric. Even though we don't have the specific number, we know that it is declining. And I would agree that it's declining. It's what we call, and we'll get into some definitions here. So here's some definitions. You have inflation, which basically means inflation is going in a positive direction. Then you have deflation, which means inflation is going in a negative direction, right? Which means that prices are declining. So the CPI, inflation is typically measured by the CPI, and the CPI is this consumer price index, which typically measures the prices of goods and services. Are they going up? Are they going down? Which way are they going? Now you've got hundreds and hundreds of prices. Some are going up, some are going down, but in aggregate, they're going in a certain direction, and that is the number, the aggregate. The calculation of the aggregate is up for debate. So when the CPI is positive, right now, let's say it's 4%, it's 4% a year is what it's going up, according to that metric, right? Now, if it was negative 4%, it means prices are going down 4% a year. Now, we are very adamant we do not want deflation. Japan had deflation for a long period of time, and it caused a lot of financial challenges in that country that still exist. But deflation is what people don't want. Now, there's another few definitions you need to know. One is called disinflation. So disinflation is a decline in the rate of increase. So it's a little bit weird. So it's like if last year inflation was 5%, this year it's 4%, we have disinflation. It means that it's still going up, but at a declining rate, at a lower rate. So that's an important definition you need to know. And then the last we need to know is what we call hyperinflation. Now, most people worry about hyperinflation, and they should. Hyperinflation is really dangerous. Hyperinflation, most people think, is a period of high inflation. Now, for those of you historians, you know about Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was notorious for their hyperinflation. They had a $100 trillion note. Like your dollar, you get like a $1, $100 bill. They had a $100 trillion note. Now, I so happen here to have a $200 million Zimbabwe note right on my desk.
Why are we even doing this anymore? If you've got $2 million Zimbabwe note, I mean, there's no reason for you to even show up to work anymore.
Doug, I'm going to recant what you just said. I have a $200 million note. Not we. Yeah. I have it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You, I mean, I know why I have to show up to work, but you no longer, I mean, I don't know why you're showing up to work. Why is this podcast even running? I mean, you've got $2 million in your hand.
So I can rub this in your face every time we do it, Doug. I could say, look at me. I'm rich.
You do it quite often, Kurt. And then I look at that stick of gum that I could buy, that I can't buy, that you can, and It's a sad day.
Someday, Doug. Someday you'll have one
You know
too.
how to take me down. You know where to hit me where it hurts, Kurt.
Someday you work really hard and save up all your ducats. You'll get there, Doug. So when hyperinflation happens, what basically happens is we have really, really high inflation. Now, most people think that hyperinflation is high inflation. It's actually not. Hyperinflation is what happens when people lose confidence in your currency. So hyperinflation is not 10% or 20% or even 100%. You could have high inflation, it'd be 100%. It still might not be hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is what happens when you lose confidence in the currency. So there's these stories. Zimbabwe, if you look at the German Reichsmarks, if you look at, I think, Venezuela right now, if you look at these other countries where the Turkey had high inflation. I forget what the rate was, but it was really high. It wasn't a hyperinflation. And what hyperinflation is when you don't want to keep cash in your bank because it devalues so quickly. If you have hyperinflation and it's 100% increase a year, that means if you have $100 in your bank, by the end of the year, you can buy $50 worth of stuff. You still have that 100 on your bank statement, but it's worth half as much. So what happens in hyperinflation is people try to get rid of their dollars as quickly as possible. They don't want to sit on them because they're just basically turning into worthless. Up until the point where they have these pictures of people having wheelbarrows of bills, just wheeling them around full of bills so they can buy a loaf of bread. That's hyperinflation. That's when people don't trust the currency anymore and they end up using other currencies like gold or crypto or something else. Or in some cases, other countries might use the US dollar because their currencies are worthless. So my point is hyperinflation usually gets a bad rap as being high inflation. It is high, but it's not. High inflation does not mean hyperinflation. And I want to really be clear about this because if you don't understand that it's a loss of trust in the government currency, then you could make bad decisions because hyperinflation, you definitely want to own hard assets. High inflation, hit or miss, depends on what's going on. So I want to go through a few things because if you don't understand how and why inflation works, you're probably going to miss a few things. So here's some things to understand. Most people say the printing of money leads to inflation. That's what we call a half-truth. So yes, that statement is correct, but it's not the full truth. Here's an example. Let's say I'm the Federal Reserve and I decide I want to create inflation in the economy. So I say I'm going to print up $100 quadrillion, which is much larger than anything. I don't even know if the world has $10 quadrillion, but $100 quadrillion, dwarf anything else that exists. I take all those dollars and I put it in a bank vault, and I shut the door. No one sees it. No one uses it. Did I create inflation? No, I did not create inflation. Here's why. Because the creation of money in itself does not create inflation. It is the creation of money plus the use of that money and the amount of times that the money is used in circulation is what is deemed inflation. So inflation is the printing of money plus what we call, or times the velocity of money. So how many times those dollars rotate through society. So if you take $100 quadrillion and stick it in a bank vault, the velocity is zero. It means it doesn't count. You're not using those dollars. So it's almost like they didn't exist because they don't. You put them in a bank vault. Do they really exist? I don't know. No one sees them. No one can use them. So that's kind of the misconception a lot of people have, is that the government is printing up all this money. Oh my God, we're going to have hyperinflation. Well, the government has been printing up money since 2008. Why don't we have hyperinflation? In many ways, I would argue we had deflation for a few years during the 2010s. It wasn't acknowledged, but in my calculation, we did. So if that's the case, why did that even happen? They were printing money. It's because the velocity of money was declining. The velocity of money has fallen through the floor. So if you look at COVID, where they printed up a large amount of money, and yet the velocity of money fell through the floor. That is a huge factor. I'm actually trying to bring up the chart here so I can share it. I don't know if you have that, Doug. Here we go. V2 velocity money. All right. So here is the velocity of money. And come on, you can do it, computer. Don't fail me now. All right. Here's the velocity of money. Okay. This is the M2 money stock velocity of money. As you can see, it was pretty flat for the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, up until the 90s when it took off, went from 1.8 to 2.2, and then it's declined ever since, up until COVID, where it dropped through the floor. And then it flatlined, and now it's picked up back to where it was before. So, what you want to watch for is not just the amount of money printing. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people send out tweets and posts. Oh my God, look at all the money printed. Yeah, so what? How about showing me the velocity of money combined with that? Well, they're printing money now. Okay, the velocity of money is going up. That's meaningful. That makes sense. But if you just take one side of the equation, how do you even know if the equation's correct? Because you can't see the other pieces. It's like what's 2 times x? I don't know. What's x? I don't know. So how do you know the answer? You don't. That's the whole point. You need both pieces to be able to accurately determine if we have inflation or not. Now, if you understand how this works, you'll be better able to navigate the inflation. I call it inflation porn, right? The hyperinflation porn. Oh my God, things are going to end tomorrow. It's like the apocalypse porn that everybody looks at. Oh my God, the world's going to end. We're going to have a civil war. It's all bunk. It's all meant to get you fearful and scared, so you watch the media. It's not true. It's not going to happen. Now, here's the other thing. You do need to be aware that new money is being created, right? Money's actually not being created right now. The Fed's balance sheet is shrinking. But you do need to be aware that when money being printed equals inflation. And so what people don't understand is the impact of different types of inflation. And here's another thing I want to share, is there's different kinds of inflation. One kind of inflation is what we would call consumer price inflation, right? CPI, right? That's consumer price index, but consumer price inflation, right? That is where your prices of goods and services are visibly going higher. So COVID, they said it was 23% inflation. Not with me. My prices went up 100%. My grocery bills went up 100% or more. And most other people were the same. They had really high grocery bills after it was not 20%, but that's what they claimed it was, right? So when my goods that I buy every day go up, that means I'm poorer, unless my wages go up of a similar amount. Now, my wages didn't go up 100%, but my expenses did, which means I'm poorer than I was before because I'm making less. I'm making the same amount for more expensive items. So I have less money to do other things. So when that happens, that's a problem. That's when Joe and Susie Lunchbox, who are being really good stewards of their financial health and pinching pennies, doing coupons, making sure they balance their checkbook every month, those people are getting squeezed because they're not getting raises and the price of what they're doing is going up, which means they have less to spend on iPhones and vacations and all the other stuff they want. Now, rich people don't get affected as much because they have more wealth, but for the average middle class person, they do get impacted. That is really dangerous when the goods and services go up and your wages don't. Now, there's another kind of inflation that happens that has been happening for a while, and it's a silent inflation. And this is a little bit more hard to understand. And a lot of people do because it's been going on for 15 years, but I think most average people don't. Here's what it is. It's called what we call asset price inflation. Now, what is asset price inflation? Asset price inflation is basically what's happened since 2008. Actually, it happened before then, but let's use 2008 as an example. Because before then it was, real estate prices were going through the roof, then they crashed. Let's start in 2008. The federal government printed, they called quantitative easing, basically printing money. However, it didn't go into the consumer's hands because prices of goods and services didn't go up. In many cases, they went down. If you looked at commodity prices, they went down. If you looked at the price of goods and services, they were flatlined. Some went down, some went up, but basically not a lot went up. Yet asset prices went through the roof. You look at the stock market, keeps climbing higher. Real estate prices keeps climbing higher. So what's happening is you have asset price inflation, which is a lot more subtle and dangerous. And what happens there is basically the middle class and the poor don't feel it. They don't feel the inflation because they're not impacted by asset prices. They don't care what real estate does because they're basically paying for their rent, they're paying for their food, and they're paying for a good night out and their, whatever, their car. Those prices didn't change. In many ways, like even car prices dropped. They were really low before a lot of things happened, and like Fukushima and COVID and all that. But car prices were really low. They're really cheap. Yet asset prices went through the roof. So the danger in that is that when real estate goes up, it becomes unaffordable for the middle class. Like right now, like it's really hard for people to have a starter home. Everything's too expensive. So you basically have this big price discrepancy because of quantitative easing. And quantitative easing isn't noticeable by everybody. So it's happening. Real estate keeps going up, stock market keeps going up. So the wealthy who have wealth, who have investments, get wealthier, and everyone else gets poorer. So in comparison, that's happening. It's happening slowly. It doesn't happen overnight, but it's happening slowly. So it's not noticeable, but it keeps happening. And that's why the rich keep getting richer. That's why real estate is such a good investment, because you can borrow money, the debt gets cheaper, and the asset prices get more expensive. So you make a lot of money in real estate as long as they have that kind of environment. That is something you really need to understand. Another thing you need to understand, and then we're going to put it back to Doug. Actually, two quick things. So the first is, what are things that cause inflation and deflation? One of them is the government's printing of money, right? So quantitative easing, as they call it, is when they print money. It's not technically printing money, but it equates to the same thing. And basically, they're buying government debts. The government goes out and borrows money, and then they buy it, and it's just this cycle of basically creating more money. And I'm not saying it's not valuable in certain circumstances, but it's certainly not something you keep your foot on the gas for like 20 years, which they've pretty much done. So that's quantitative easing. That typically causes asset price inflation, not consumer goods inflation. Now, if you have something like COVID stim checks, like Trump bucks, as they were calling them, the Trump bucks or the EIDL money or the other ones, the COVID loans and the free money, all of that allowed cash to get into circulation. People were spending it. That caused inflation because you have more money chasing the same amount of goods, or fewer goods in the case of COVID, because there wasn't as much goods. But people had money and they're willing to spend it, so they spent it. And so all that cash going directly in the hands of consumers causes consumer price inflation. Now, you also had supply chain disruptions. That's when you couldn't get your goods because the whole world was shut down. No one was making them. That supply chain disruption causes inflation because it costs the cost of producing goods to go up. I don't know if you remember, but lumber prices went through the roof. They were something like $700 a unit, up to like, I don't know, it was like $2,400 at one point. Went through the roof because you couldn't get the wood. So how are you going to get the wood? Well, someone's got to cut it down. Then they got to bring it to the mill. They got to mill it. They got to cut it. They do all this stuff. Well, no one was working. Well, you got to pay people to come back to work. So they wouldn't come back to work. So you had to pay them like double. Okay, well, now your price of producing the lumber goes up. So the supply chain disruptions caused massive price spikes, which in part led to the 9% CPI number, as well as the fact that it was probably a lot higher, like 100%, but 9% that year. So that can cause inflation. It can also cause deflation when you have globalization, which is what we've had for the last 20 years, which means we've outsourced our labor to China. So instead of paying somebody 50 grand a year, you can pay them $50 a month. Well, your cost of goods goes way down, which means that the cost of goods that you can buy them goes way down, right? So you used to have one TV in your house. Now you have one in every room. You have a TV on your phone. Everything has gotten cheaper. because of globalization. So supply chain disruptions is basically the reverse of globalization. Now you also have technological advances. Technological advances are basically deflationary. So you used to be able to have a computer on your desk cost $2,000 and you could barely do a math problem. Now it's doing 10,000 math problems a second and it costs you the same amount. So the technological advances are deflationary by nature because it's cheaper to get the same amount of stuff you got before and you get better quality goods for the same price. So it's highly deflationary, which in many ways is a factor we have to contend with. It is always going to be deflationary. We have to decide whether we want to accept it or whether we want to fight it. And then the last piece, before I hand over to Doug, is population. So population is a huge impact on inflation. If you have a decline in population or workforce, that is deflationary. France has a declining population. Now, they also have a problem with immigration. They're allowing immigrants in the country, and it's changing the culture of France. Now, this is not an argument about pro or con of immigration policies, but I understand why, is the point. The reason they're doing it is because when you have a population shrinking, it means you have deflation. It means your economy shrinks, which is a problem if your economy is built on debt. Now, in this country, we have a stagnant population. It has been declining. Disinflationary. It's not been declining, but it's been disinflationary. It's still going up, but at a declining rate. And so we're allowing immigration to happen. Now, you could make your own decisions about why. That's not the point of the show. But it is happening. It has been happening under the last Republican and Democratic administrations for the last 20 years. It hasn't stopped. Now, Trump, I know, wanted to be against it. Whatever the outcome, it was still going on. You can't get rid of all of it. There needs to be reform around the whole thing because there's no easy answer. But the point is a declining population is deflationary and it's harmful for most economies, or that's how it's judged. So governments are very fearful about decline in populations because it destroys economies. So a lot of them are allowing immigration so that it doesn't decline, which is stupid long term. Short term, they feel like, oh, we're solving a problem. Long term, it's going to destroy the culture of any country that allows it without any sort of policy, immigration policy that is normal, right? You don't just let criminals in. You let in people that you want to bring in, right? You make it a reasonable policy and you let people in. I don't think a lot of people disagree with that. But point being is that's what causes inflation, deflation. Those are some of the biggest factors. Now, I might have missed some. I want to give Doug a chance to talk, but I did want to lay that out because I think a lot of people don't understand, and people are talking right now. Oh, we're going to have inflation; it's going to come back. I'm not seeing it right now. I'm not. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I mean, it could. Things could change, but given the current state of affairs today, inflation's declining. It's disinflationary, and it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. If we have a recession, it's going to keep happening. So I think you have to be prepared for lower inflation for the foreseeable future until something drastically changes, which case I'll update my thoughts. But for right now, that's what you should prepare for. You should not be worrying about inflation. Well, people say gold's going up. It doesn't matter. Gold is not a one-to-one on inflation. Just be aware that the inflation rate is declining and will probably get pretty low given the current glide path that we're going. Doug, I want to give you a chance to talk because I've monopolized the conversation so far.
Goodness gracious, Kirk. Yeah, I'm trying to think where to keep up, and I don't know if I have the ability to share because it might be easier for me to kind of jump around that way if I can. But let's start with one thing I thought was interesting. Jumping back to you asked, like, how did they come up with the 2%? Right? Where did that come from? This is not. I mean, this is something that is pervasive in so many different things that we know of today that we use in everyday as everyday benchmarks. Let me ask you a question, Kirk. You could probably rattle this off the top of your head. What is one of the first steps that people say you should do if you want to start to get in shape?
Stop eating bad food.
That's one of them. So eat better.
Go to the gym.
Go to the gym, or let's say the gym's a little too impactful. What's the first thing they say to get out and start to do?
Go for a walk.
Go for a walk. And you probably know how many steps.
I don't know. I don't do steps, but 10,000, something like
There
that.
you go. Exactly.
Okay.
You knew it. You just didn't even know you knew it. Okay. We've come out to this, and we got these little pedometers. People take these steps to get out there. It's like, I get in my 10,000 steps, and we are programmed to believe that we should take our 10,000 steps. Now let's say this for a fact. It is absolutely going to be in your best interest to get out there and take 10,000 steps. It means you're moving as opposed to sitting all day. I myself right now, I'm standing at my desk because when I have meetings and we're doing this, sitting all day, no, absolutely correlated. And I'm going to come back and causative to health issues. But guess what? Where do you think that 10,000 steps came from? Do you think that was from, decades of science, Kirk?
Made up.
Completely made up. The idea of walking 10,000 steps originated with a marketing campaign in the 1960s. It was a Japanese marketing campaign, actually. They were actually looking at creating a meter, and the pedometer that they created was called the Manpokai, which translates to the 10,000 steps meter. It's completely a marketing campaign.
I think I heard about this.
Yep.
Yeah, that's funny. I forgot about that.
But it has absolutely now been taken as part of scientific, theory that
Trust the science, Doug.
What?
Trust the science.
Trust the science, right? So we have all generally accepted that. That actually started as a marketing campaign, which, by the way, also the case with, you go back to real estate, talking about why having real estate is a great correlation to wealth. Guess what? It didn't used to be that way in previous generations. This was actually, I believe it was either a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac advertisement campaign to get people to buy more homes. So understand that a lot of this stuff is brought up. It's either comes from something that was built in the back offices of Mad Men, which those of you who watch the show, it's all about advertising campaigns, or just randomly thrown out there. The other thing I wanted to talk about is you mentioned something about the silent inflation, right? Here's the thing about steady silent inflation. We're back to 2%. It's great. All of this works until it doesn't, right? Like so many things. It's fine and dandy if we're getting 2-3% a year. Okay. It's something that's just built into the equation that's going to happen. And that's the slow inflation. But then all of a sudden, all you takes is one catalyst, like basically 2020 to 2023, when inflation spiked through the roof. The problem with that is, yes, we are taking that 2 to 3%, and for a while there was actually even under 2%. But when you now add 20% in, and now it's like, hey, we're back. We're only 2% growth. It's 2% growth off of the 20 spike. And that 20 spike is what people can't handle. Okay. That's where it tips the scales, and it tips the scales irretrievably broken. Okay. So if we take a look at a couple things here, I just want to talk about kind of impacts of inflation here. And I'm just going to go randomly all over the place. Again, I don't know. Can I share, Kirk? Is that something?
Yeah, just put it in the thing, and I'll just let me know, and I'll share it.
Okay,
I'm not going to try to figure it out right now.
All right, sounds good. We'll figure that out for later. So first of all, and again, there's no particular order of this because I'm just kind of going around the space here. But I'm going to just put these in the chat for you, and you can just click on it. So first of all, what does inflation actually mean? Okay, so if we take a look from 1967 to present, the S&P 500 was up 6,540%. If we take that and we use that as an inflation-adjusted index, the S&P 500 is only up 600% over that same 60 years. So you're talking a 10% per year impact versus 100% per year impact over that same period of time. Okay, significant difference in terms of what that means. Because as much as it's grown, the ability to use that net after everything else has gotten more expensive is significantly diminished. And you can see here that a sizable amount of that, according to this chart, is but from Bravos Research, has been since about 1995. That's when it really took from a very kind of steady steady growth, a great return to. Obviously, there was a kind of bouncing around, a lot more volatility. Let's just put it this way: a lot more volatility from 1995 till around 2009. And then, of course, what has happened since 2009? We've been in a significantly, positive, unchecked growth in the markets. Now, ultimately, but what you feel from that is significantly different. The other thing that we're wanting to look at here is that we're talking about the debt's growing, the debt's everywhere, public debt. I'm just going to read these off because I don't think I can go fast enough. But in 40 years, the U.S. debt rose from 1 trillion to 35 trillion. That took 40 years. Now, there's going to be $3 trillion. There was a $3 trillion increase just last year alone. So if you take that, with the history of that debt rise, it was about 1 trillion a year over 40 years. At that same rate, we will hit the same amount of growth in 10 years. Okay. So we've got an issue with the amount of debt that the U.S. We're now at a point in which the amount of tax of money that's coming in from different sources, taxation, things like that, are barely able to cover those basic interest payments. And it's about to get to the point where the GDP is not going to be able to support that. That's obviously something. When you start talking about hyperinflation, those are the things that obviously, when you look at the world investing in U.S. debt, when it's long as you said, take that $2 trillion, $2 million note that you've got, as long as everybody wants that note, it's not a big issue. But when people stop to see that as a value, that's when you start to look at hyperinflation. There is, we talked about assets increasing. Again, you said you don't feel that we're currently in a position where we're going to continue to see inflation, that there's limited signs of it. At this point, it seems to be the case because I'll give you an example, ammo. Okay. 3 years ago, everybody was clamoring for ammo. Okay. There was a lot of things going on and people were trying to buy it, and COVID hit and factories were shut down. There's one ammo that I know someone was looking at. It was a 7 millimeter cartridge for hunting. This went up to $100 a box. Once the factories reopened and they started to try to produce enough to meet that demand, they're now in an oversupply situation. And now those same cartridges are almost down to only a dollar a round. So basically went from $100 to $20 a box. Okay, that's deflationary, right? That's less than it was prior to it jumping to $100 a box. It used to be on average about $3 a box. We're now looking at about $30 a box. We're now down to 20. Okay, that's going to be a deflationary to the manufacturers of it. Homes are currently now sitting on average, 48% of U.S. homes had been on the market for at least 60 days in August. That's the highest since 2019. So we know there was a mad rush. Prices went through the roof right after COVID. People were buying homes. A lot of people working more at their homes. Now we're starting to see the share of homes sitting on the market 60 plus days rose from 43% a year earlier, and it's the fifth straight monthly increase. Guess what? The longer homes sit on the market, the more deflationary that becomes. Certain people are going to have to make decisions. Now, about 50% of mortgages are paid off in this country. But if one person out there isn't in that circumstance that has to sell their home and they have to decide to undercut the market to get theirs to move, they lower their price at resets comps for everybody else. And that's when you start to see the domino on real estate effect there. Federal student loan debt just hit $1.61 trillion in fiscal year 2024, near the highest on record. Since 2007, student debt has tripled, according to the National Student Loan Data System. Over 10 million borrowers, accounting to 25% of the market, were behind on those payments. We saw this coming. I talked about this last year when they finally made student loan payments go back into being enforced. Now we're starting to see people fall behind. On top of that, we're also seeing the ratio of retired American workers relative to working age population. Retired is 25% in 2024, the most on record. So you're talking about population decline. We have less people working. That's less tax revenue. Over the last 14 years, the percentage has risen from 16% of the number of retirement workers to 25% of the workforce. The other thing I was looking at here, and again, jumping around. You talked about U.S. population growth. It's still positive, but there was some new research that was put out that we are looking at a U.S. population growth close to zero. Okay, so it's not there. It's in 2021. So basically, from this research here, if we go back to 1901, the U.S. population year-to-year change of the U.S. population was about 2%. It dropped down in the teens. I think that most people can see that correlates very heavily to both the Spanish flu and World War I. And then it rose again. It dipped in the 30s. And then, of course, it went back to its peak. Hence, the baby boomer population, 1951. We had a little bit of a spike with, along the years in the early 90s. But look, we are down since the Spanish flu and World War I. We're at the lowest rate of change in the U.S. population. So guess what? We're going to have to get people in through immigration or make more babies. And the latter does not seem to be of interest of anybody. Okay. So
I'm too old for that, Doug. I'm past my prime.
It's out of my window. And if you read the research out there on the younger generations, whether or not it's because they're just not as interested in each other, they are talking about things like data, like sperm count and other things that are down. But also, to be honest, when people are still living with their parents and they're having trouble buying those inflated assets, it does not create a scenario that is ideal for someone to go out there and have a family. And then we've got a number of people working multiple jobs in the U.S. hit 8.66 million. That's a new record. That's 300,000 above the peak seen before the pandemic, 600,000 above the 2008 peak. So you have less people. You have more people working multiple jobs. That's certainly not conducive to having children. U.S. credit card interest rates now have gone up. That's putting pressure. You talked about middle and lower class. 23% in August, a new record. Over the last 2 years, they've soared by 7 percentage points. Think about that. You're managing a household. You're trying to pay for food, clothing. Everything's gone more expensive. And at the same time, anything you already paid for, your past income that you paid for things that you had a shortfall, you are now getting 7% more per year on cost on that. And if you add that up, if you've got 10,000, that's $700 more that you're paying over the course of the year. You start adding $50, $100, $200 a month in payments, it gets harder and harder to get out of that cycle. And so now again, deflationary, we talked about, air travel demand's finally starting to wane. So we might see some deflation that's going to be happening possibly for the first time in several years in travel. That will be nice. But guess what? With all those extra payments, Kirk, I don't know if anybody's going to be able to afford travel. Hence why it's going down.
Not my trip, Doug. I just bought plane flights to Nashville. It was not cheap. It was more expensive than I ever paid, and I never want to travel again.
Yeah, ridiculous. To be honest, when I do travel these days, I take first class a lot. Not because I'm spoiled and high on the hog. It's because economy class has gotten to the point in which sometimes first class is $100 more. Okay? I'm going to pay $800 or $900 for a flight, and it's only $700 for coach to sit there with no room. You just got to start to look at comfort and balance. It's incredibly expensive for even basic economy, and they're taking more and more things away. You can start seeing that on Southwest. There's a huge battle going on with Southwest right now to pretty much eliminate all of the things that made Southwest great, which to some people was the cattle call, and some people was not having to pay for a bag. You're going to see that disappear. They just ousted their CEO. Their major investor is pressuring to basically turn them into the same nickel and dime of everybody else. By the way, speaking of that nickel and dime, how's that working out for Spirit? They just declared bankruptcy.
The Massa movement, Doug, make Southwest great again, or
right. Yeah, exactly. So, we've got, a number of things. By the way, going back to those relationships, just saw that. This was an interesting one. It's completely unrelated to, finance directly. But 1980-ish was about the first time that people could meet online. That's when technology started to take off. Prior to that, meeting through friends since 1950, how couples met. I find this fascinating. About 25% of couples met through their friends, and that rose to about the mid, 38, 35%. And that was really pretty steady between, say, 1960 to around 2000. Through family used to be a lot higher, but that steadily declined. Work took over and really became a place where people met, where couples met. Again, could be tied to Mad Men. Maybe a lot of those couples were meeting while they were still married because a lot of that happened, spending time there together. But we saw a steady rise between basically 1960 up through 1980, which is the Mad Men period. And then you also saw meeting at the bar rise about the same time. So again, work, alcohol. I'm saying, but I'm not saying. Grade school, that used to be a lot higher. Almost 20% met in grade school and then ended up, having a long-term, a relationship. I'm surprised to see that college wasn't higher. I mean, a lot of people I know met in college and married, but from 1980 on, look at the spike of online. It is completely eliminated how most couples in America are meeting. Now, I don't, there are people out there professing this is a bad thing. I don't know if these people are meeting online and getting married and having kids and it's a healthy relationship, then great if we broke down the barriers. But it also, I think, is indicative of how much of a decline of just that social interaction there are. So if we've taken friends and work and bars, which might be a good thing, and family and grade school and college and neighbors, and taken almost every one of them down under 10%, it does says something to me about connection and how that has, changed significantly and probably forever. And as we look at things like AI rising and technology rising and how, again, we're creating these digital personalities. One thing I think, and this is just a kind of a pedestal stand on, that we really need to think about just as a society, and a lot of repercussions of this is just the art of real connection. And I think there's definitely something struggling there that I don't know if there's a fix for it. By the way, auto insurance, I wanted this last one on the interest side of it. Auto insurance rates in the U.S. up 52% since 2022, biggest 3-year spike since 1975. I don't have any data on this, but just look at utilities as well. Utilities, I know that my utilities are 3 times what they were 4 years ago. So I just kind of some data to kind of correlate what you're speaking of. I think we're starting to see this slow down, this cost increase, this inflation, and we may not have any further inflation. As a matter of fact, there's several areas there where we're seeing deflation. But when you have multiple years of 10+%, and you've taken pricing and cost of households in many areas up over 100% over that time frame, in some cases up to 300%, and you don't give that back, then yeah, the middle class and the low and the the bottom class of incomes are going to continue to struggle. And if they're not producing enough from their own taxes and other sources of revenue, and we have all this debt that needs to be maintained, there's going to be challenges that are going to be very, very hard to overcome in the long run. But one last thing I want to say that's completely unrelated to this, it's just a correlation thing, and I love this stuff. I think the biggest problem is Warren Buffett, Kirk. I think he's the cause of everything. Because I was looking at, the struggle, and there is absolutely a gender pay gap in the United States. It's been talked about for a long time, but as you can see here, that gender pay gap is completely correlated to the rise of Berkshire Hathaway stock. In other words, Kirk, Warren Buffett is the reason that women are struggling with their pay gap in society. He's been oppressing women. He's been oppressing the lower class. I think we need to come and go after Warren Buffett. What say you?
Well, looking at this chart crime, Doug, I can't disagree. I mean, obviously his stock price is going up as gender pay gap is going up. So obviously Warren Buffett is to blame. I mean, data is data. Look at it. It's obvious. It's science. Look at the science, Doug. Follow the science. All right, we got to wrap it up here. We're running a little long. Doug, where can people find more about you?
Thanks, Kirk. I didn't realize it ran long. I was just listening to you for so long. Yes. Hey, listen, I know we're running late. There's a lot of things I talked about. I talked about the cost of student loan debt. Look, even the wealthy are struggling with this. Most people don't have enough past income, which is what they've saved. And now they're relying on current income to try to cover the gap of cost of college. And for many families, that's not even enough. Even if it is, you're struggling and working this week to be able to have enough income to pay for that cost of college next week. That adds a lot of risks. It adds a risk of what happens to your income if you lose a job or health or something happens to you with mortality. But either way, even if you have enough, that's redirecting critical dollars from your future. It means less wealth for you. And every dollar you move towards college is potentially adding up to hundreds of thousands of lost wealth for your future. And we already said everything's getting more expensive. You can't afford to move a dollar that you're going to need in the future. Find out now how to pay for college and how to protect yourself from being stuck with the debt, which is the default for most Americans. There's $1.4 trillion plus of student loan debt out there. How do you protect yourself? How do you make sure your child is going to be able to go to their school of choice? Find out more. My website is mergentcollegeadvisors.com. MERGENT, mergentcollegeadvisors.com. Go check it out. Plenty of research out there. It doesn't matter what income bracket you're in. This is something you need to be looking at now.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for coming on, Doug. We're going to wrap it up here in the interest of time. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us in Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name is Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisory Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast in the podcast app of your choosing. You can also check out the show at moneytreepodcast.com. On the website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Also, please check out our YouTube channel. When you're there, please subscribe and leave a comment. Lastly, please leave a show rating and comment on the podcast app of your choice. Oh, and don't forget, this show is for informational use only. We're not telling you what to think, merely how to think about investing. We're also not selling any products or services, so do not consider this advice. If you have any problems with the show, I blame Putin. Please send me an email, express your feelings. If you're seeking financial advice, talk to an oracle or a fortune teller or maybe just a licensed financial advisor. I'm one, but as I said earlier, I'm not selling anything. But I'm easy to find. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one cares about your money like you do, so invest